The bread in your kitchen right now will be moldy and ruined within a week, maybe less, and you'll toss it in the bin like folks do every week across this whole country. But there is an old kind of bread, a bread my people and countless folks before them have made for hundreds of years, that will sit on a shelf for 6 months, a year, sometimes far longer, and stay good to eat the whole time. No refrigerator, no freezer, no preservatives, nothing. It kept sailors alive on voyages that lasted years. It fed armies and pioneers and whole families through the leanest times. And today I'm going to tell you exactly what it is and how it's made. But I'll be honest with you right from the first, the way I always am, because that title deserves a straight answer. This is not a soft, fluffy loaf like the bread you know. It's something plainer and harder and older than that. And once you understand what it is and why it keeps, you'll see it's one of the most brilliant pieces of survival food ever devised. So let me tell you all about it. Let me give you the secret straight away, because it's the same beautiful principle that keeps so many of the old foods, and once you know it, the whole thing makes sense. Ordinary bread spoils because it's full of moisture, and moisture is what mold and spoilage need to grow. A soft, fresh loaf is moist all through, and so within days the mold finds it and it's ruined. But take the moisture out, dry the bread completely, bone dry, all the way through, and the mold has nothing to grow on. A truly dry thing cannot mold. And so this old keeping bread is bread with the moisture driven out of it, baked hard and then dried out completely, until it's dry as a bone, clear through. That's the whole secret. It keeps for months and years, for the very same reason dried meat keeps, because the water that spoilage needs is simply gone. Now let me tell you what this bread actually is and how it's made. This old keeping bread goes by many names across the lands and centuries, but you may have heard it called hardtack, or ship's biscuit, or in other forms a rusk, or a twice-baked bread. And it is, at its very simplest, just flour and water, sometimes with a bit of salt, and nothing else. No yeast even, in the simplest kind, no fat, no sweetness, nothing that would spoil. Just flour and water mixed into a stiff dough, rolled out, cut into pieces, and then baked, and this is the key, baked long and slow until it's hard as a rock and dried completely through. Often it's baked more than once, twice baked, which is where that word for the twice-baked bread comes from, going back into the old tongues, baked and then baked again to drive out every last bit of moisture until it's utterly dry and hard. And what you end up with is a hard, dry, plain biscuit or bread that will keep near indefinitely, as long as you keep it dry. Let me tell you how folks made it and used it, because the story of it is remarkable. This was the bread that made long voyages possible, that fed the sailors on ships that were at sea for months and even years at a stretch, where no fresh bread could possibly last. They filled the holds with this hard, dry biscuit, and it kept the whole voyage, feeding the crew day after day. It was the bread that fed soldiers on the march and in the field, carried in their packs, keeping through long campaigns. It was the bread pioneers and travelers carried across great distances, light and lasting, that wouldn't spoil on a journey of many months. Wherever folks needed bread that would keep a long, long time with no way to keep it fresh, this hard, dry, twice-baked bread was the answer. And it answered for thousands of years, all the way back into ancient times. It is, you might say, one of the oldest and most successful survival foods humankind ever made. Now let me tell you how it's eaten, because here's the honest part, and I promised you honesty. This bread, dried hard as it is far too hard to just bite into and chew like a soft roll. You'd break a tooth trying. So it's not eaten dry and hard, it's softened first. You soak it or dunk it in something. The sailors soak theirs in water, or in their coffee, or in a stew or soup, letting it soften until it could be eaten. You break it into your hot soup or stew and let it soak up the broth and go soft and good. You dunk it in your coffee or tea of a morning. You soak it in water or milk. Softened this way, it becomes perfectly good, hearty eating, and it soaks up the flavor of whatever you soak it in besides. So that's the honest truth of this bread. It's not a soft loaf you slice and butter. It's a hard, dry, keeping biscuit that you soften in liquid to eat. But that small trade, softening it before you eat it, is a tiny price for bread that keeps 6 months, a year, or longer on the shelf. And there are gentler cousins of it worth knowing, for not all keeping bread is hard as a rock. There's the rusk, which is a bread twice baked and dried, but often made a bit richer and more pleasant, still dried for keeping, but not quite so tooth-breaking. There's the dried, twice-baked bread that folks made by taking their ordinary bread, slicing it, and drying it slow in a cool oven until it was crisp and dry all through, which would then keep far longer than the fresh loaf ever could, and was lovely dunked in coffee. This is a thing you can do with your own bread, by the way. Slice it and dry it out completely, and it becomes a keeping bread, crisp and lasting, ready to soften in a hot drink or a soup. So the family that baked more bread than it could eat before it went stale didn't waste the extra. They dried it into these crisp keeping rusks, and nothing was lost. Let me walk you through the actual making of it, the simple, hard biscuit, so you can see how plain and doable it truly is. You take your flour, and you add just enough water to bring it together into a very stiff, dry, firm dough, far stiffer than an ordinary bread dough, along with a bit of salt if you like. There's no yeast in the simplest kind, nothing to make it rise, for you want it dense and dry, not light and airy. You work that stiff dough together, and then you roll it out flat, not too thin, and you cut it into squares or rounds, whatever size suits you. Now here's an old touch worth knowing. You take a fork or a stick and you poke holes all the way through each piece. Rows of holes right through it. That's called docking, and it lets the moisture escape from the very center as it bakes, so the piece dries evenly all the way through with no damp spot hiding in the middle. Then you bake them, long and slow, in a moderate oven until they're hard and dry. And for the longest keeping, once they've baked and cooled, you bake them again, a second slow baking to drive out every last trace of moisture until they're utterly hard and bone dry clear through. Then you let them cool completely and store them dry. That's the whole of it. Flour, water, a bit of salt, rolled, cut, docked, and baked hard and dry, twice over. About as simple a food as there is, and one that will outlast near anything in your pantry. Let me tell you a bit more of the long history of it, because it's one of the oldest foods there is, and the story deepens your understanding of it. This twice-baked keeping bread goes back thousands of years, to the ancient world and before. The very word that folks use for a biscuit comes from old words meaning twice baked, twice cooked, telling you right in the name what the secret always was. The ancient armies carried it. The old sailors could not have crossed the great oceans without it, for on a voyage of months or years there was simply no other way to have bread, and so the ship's biscuit, hard and dry and lasting, was the very foundation of what fed them, packed by the ton into the holds. Explorers carried it into unknown lands. Soldiers carried it through long wars. Pioneers carried it across the wilderness. For the whole long stretch of history, when folks traveled far and lived hard with no way to keep food fresh, this humble hard bread was there, keeping, feeding, sustaining, one of the great, quiet heroes of human survival. When you make it or hold a piece of it, you're touching a food that has fed humankind through its greatest journeys and hardest times for thousands of years. There's something moving in that, to my mind. And let me tell you about another old road to long keeping bread, a gentler one, because there's more than one way folks made their bread last. There's the old sourdough way, the bread leavened not with store yeast, but with a living sour starter, kept alive from batch to batch. Now, sourdough bread, by its nature, keeps a good deal longer than ordinary bread before it molds, for the very sourness of it holds off the spoilage a while. It's not a 6-month bread on its own, not like the dried hardtack, but it stays good longer than a plain soft loaf, and it was the everyday bread of countless households for exactly that reason. a bread you could keep a good while, made from a starter you kept alive yourself with no need to buy yeast at all. And then, if you dried that good sourdough bread, sliced and baked crisp, you'd have a keeping rusk that lasted for months. So the old ways had a whole range of keeping breads, from the everyday sourdough that kept a good while, to the dried rusks that kept for months, to the hard, twice-baked biscuit that kept for years. Each had its place, and together they meant a family need never be without bread, whether for the week, the season, or the long journey. Now let me say more about the storing, because I told you dry is everything, and I want you to really understand how to keep this bread once you've made it. The great enemy is moisture, damp creeping in from the air. So you store your keeping bread sealed up tight against the damp, in a dry container, in a dry place. Kept truly dry and sealed, it lasts and lasts, months into years. The old sailors kept theirs in the driest part of the ship they could manage, and even then, the damp sea air was its great enemy. So for you, keeping it dry is simpler. Just a well-sealed container in a cool, dry cupboard. And you check it now and again, as you should check any store, to be sure it's staying dry and good. If it stayed bone dry, it's good, near indefinitely. It's honestly one of the most foolproof foods to store there is, precisely because there's no moisture in it to go bad, so long as none gets in. That's the whole reason it became the great keeping food of all those centuries. Nothing else kept so simply, so long, from such humble makings. Now let me be the honest, careful neighbor with you, and give you the plain truth about making this keeping bread, because the whole thing rests on one rule, and if you get it wrong, it fails. The one rule is this: it must be dry. Truly, completely, bone dry, all the way through, and it must be kept dry in the storing. That's everything. If there's any moisture left in the bread when you store it, or if any dampness gets to it while it's stored, then mold can grow, and it will spoil like any other bread. And worse, moldy food can make you sick, so you'd not eat it. So the whole craft is in drying it completely and keeping it completely dry. You bake it long and slow and hard until every bit of moisture is driven out, and you store it somewhere dry, sealed against any dampness, and you keep it dry. Do that, and it lasts and lasts. Let dampness reach it, and it spoils. So if you make this, learn it properly from a good trusted guide, get it truly dry, keep it truly dry, and check it now and again to be sure it's staying good. Dry is the whole secret and the whole safety of it both. And let me give you one more honest word about what this bread is for. This is not meant to be your everyday bread, the bread you enjoy at the table for its softness and warmth. It's a keeping bread, a survival bread, a bread for storing against hard times and lean times and long journeys and the days when fresh bread can't be had. It's plain and hard and simple, made for lasting, not for luxury. So think of it not as a replacement for your good fresh loaf, but as a thing to have put by, a bread that will be there, good and ready, months or years from now, when you might need it and nothing fresh can be found. That's its purpose, and for that purpose, there's hardly anything better. With all that said, honestly, let me tell you why I find this old bread so wonderful, and why it's worth knowing even if you never bake a single hard biscuit. Because it's a kind of small miracle when you really think on it. Bread, the very staff of life, the food that has fed humankind above all others, made to keep not for days but for months and years, from nothing but flour and water and the driving out of moisture, with no machine, no cold, no chemical, no preservative of any kind, just the ancient knowledge of how to make the staff of life last. Think of what that meant. It meant a family or a ship or an army or a traveler could carry good bread through the longest hard times, could store away the very foundation of eating against any future need, could never be without bread even when there was no way to bake fresh. That's an extraordinary thing, and it's a piece of knowledge that fed and saved countless lives across all of history, and that most folks today have completely forgotten, never dreaming that bread could be made to keep for years. And there's that same deep freedom in it that runs through all the old ways. The family that knows how to make bread that keeps is a family with the very staff of life laid up against any hard time. Bread that will be there no matter what befalls the store or the power or the world outside. In the old days, this knowledge was part of what let folks weather anything. The deep stores of keeping food, the bread that lasted, the security of knowing you'd have bread come what may. It's not about fear. It's about that calm, deep, self-reliant security that a full and lasting store brings. The knowing that your family will eat, that there will be bread, whatever comes. Let me tell you, there's a real satisfaction in holding a batch of this bread you've made yourself, knowing it'll be good months and months from now. I remember the first time I understood it as a boy, being shown hard biscuit that had been kept a long while and was still perfectly good, and marveling that bread, which I only knew as a thing that went stale and moldy within days, could be made to last like that. It changed how I thought about food and keeping, that a thing so humble as flour and water, treated with a bit of old wisdom, could become a store against any hard time. And there's a deep, quiet comfort in having some put by. A tin of good hard biscuit in the cupboard is a small anchor of security, a bit of the staff of life that will be there, ready, whatever the months ahead may bring. The old folks took great comfort in their stores, and this keeping bread was among the most dependable of all of them. Let me also say a word about making it a bit more pleasant. For there's room, too, if you're making it to enjoy, rather than purely to survive on. The very plainest hardtack, just flour and water, is made for maximum keeping and minimum fuss, and it's plain indeed. But the rusks and the twice-baked breads can be made a good deal nicer while still keeping well. A bit of seasoning, and for the ones you'll eat sooner rather than store for years, even a little fat or sweetness, though know that adding fat does shorten the keeping, for fat itself can go rancid in time. So there's a balance in it. The purest keeping bread is the plainest, flour and water dried hard, which keeps the very longest, and the more you add to make it pleasant, the shorter it tends to keep. The old folks understood this trade and made both, the plain, hard biscuit for the long store and the long journey, and the nicer dried rusks for the nearer eating. You can choose where on that scale you want to be, depending on whether you're making bread to enjoy this month or to lay up against next year. And it's worth asking, as always, how we ever came to forget such a useful thing. And the answer is the same as ever. The store got close, with its fresh bread every day, and the refrigerator and the freezer came along to keep the soft loaf a while, and so the need for bread that kept itself simply fell away, and with it the knowledge. Why learn to make bread that lasts for years when you can buy a fresh, soft loaf any day of the week? And so, one generation to the next, the old keeping breads were forgotten. Until now, most folks have never heard of hardtack and would never dream that bread could be made to last for months. But it was never lost, only set aside. The knowledge is all still there, simple as it ever was. Flour and water and patient drying, waiting for anyone who wishes to pick it back up, whether for the deep security of a keeping store or simply for the satisfaction of turning yesterday's stale loaf into a lasting rusk instead of throwing it away. So here's what I'd leave you with. Even if you never make it, I want you to carry away the wonder and the knowledge of it, that bread can be made to keep for 6 months, a year, and more, through nothing but the old wisdom of driving out the moisture, and that this bread fed sailors and soldiers and pioneers and whole families across thousands of years of history. And should you ever wish to try it, to lay up a store of keeping bread against hard times, or simply to dry your extra loaves into crisp, lasting rusks instead of wasting them, the old knowledge is right there waiting, simple as flour and water and patient baking. Learn it properly. Get it bone dry. Keep it dry. And you'll have bread that outlasts near anything, ready whenever you need it. Try even the simplest piece of it. The next time you've bread going stale before you can eat it, don't toss it. Slice it and dry it out slow and completely in a low oven until it's crisp and dry through, and store it dry, and you've made yourself a keeping bread, a crisp rusk to dunk in your coffee or soften in your soup that will keep far longer than the fresh loaf ever would. From that small beginning, the whole old art of keeping bread is yours to reclaim, a piece of the deep, self-reliant wisdom that let our ancestors carry the staff of life through any hardship, and that is every bit as true and useful today as it ever was. If this is the kind of practical old wisdom you've been hungry for, the kind that got quietly set aside and forgotten, then stay here with me. There's so much more where this came from, and I aim to bring it back to you, one piece at a time. Subscribe, and we'll keep remembering the old ways together, because some of the most useful things we ever knew are the simple ones we let ourselves forget. And the making of bread that lasts is surely one of the most remarkable of them all.